In the early 1520s, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, along with his crew, employed by the Spanish crown, set out to circumnavigate the globe, exploring the coast of South America in the process. They intended to reach the Maluku Islands of Indonesia, setting up a western sea route to hasten their trade of spices across the isles. This expedition started out as a success for Magellan. He was the first European to chart what would later be dubbed the Strait of Magellan, a navigable stretch of sea that separated the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans between mainland Chile and the Tierra del Fuego archipelago. He would also make it across the Pacific to the islands of East Asia soon after, and fulfill his request to the Spanish. His luck, however, would not last. He would soon die in battle with the inhabitants of the Philippine Island of Mactan upon reaching East Asia in 1521. It is through the words of one of Magellan's men, the Venetian scholar and explorer Antonio Pigafetta, that the subject of today's video can be explored. Pigafetta was one of the few men on board Magellan's expedition who returned safely to Western Europe in 1522, and he wasn't short of tales to tell of his voyage. Among them was an account of an unusual sighting that supposedly took place along the coastlines of Patagonia while on the South American leg of the journey. According to the explorer, a race of giant humans, twice the height of any other, were living along the coastlines and forests of Patagonia. It's a claim that skewed European perceptions of the region for almost 300 years to follow. But what did Pigafetta actually see on his travels to the west? In this video, we will be breaking down the claims and legends behind the mysterious giants of Patagonia, taking a look at the historical accounts and attempting to explain the truth behind the sightings. Join us as we trace Magellan's steps to the coastlines of Patagonia, investigating the mysterious giants who reportedly lived there. While Pigafetta was the first to write about the supposed giants of Patagonia, he was not the last. Early sightings of giants on the shores of South America would spread across Europe, and explorers from other countries would soon report similar sightings. But what exactly did Pigafetta report? The sighting reportedly occurred while their ship was in port, after the crew had sailed around a stretch of wooded coastline. While the crew rested, they noted the arrival of a large man on the shore, twice the height of any man on board the ship. He was supposedly ritualistically singing and dancing, but the specific details were not recorded. Pigafetta writes, quote, "One day we suddenly saw a naked man of giant stature on the shore of the port, dancing, singing, and throwing dust on his head. The Captain General," this would have been Magellan, "sent one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same actions as a sign of peace." End quote. The encounter does indeed seem to have been peaceful. The supposed giant then had an encounter with Magellan himself, and there seems to have been no animosity or caution between the two. Pigafetta in his report continues, quote, "Having done that, the man led the giant to an islet where the Captain General was waiting. When the giant was in the Captain General's and our presence, he marveled greatly, and made signs with one finger raised upward, believing that we had come from the sky. He was so tall that we reached only his waist, and he was well proportioned." End quote. While the giants were friendly, Magellan is said to have had two of the giants board his ship with a view to take them back to Spain. Whether or not he forced them to do so is not recorded, but, perhaps conveniently, they were both noted to have died on the voyage home. The explorer included only sparse details about his encounter with the man, and although he was reportedly naked, many subsequent illustrations of the giants were shown with basic clothing. They are often shown with long, flowing hair and exaggerated facial features, sometimes wielding long staffs, almost twice the height of a European explorer. They were often shown without shoes, but supposedly wore giant moccasins made from the skin of guanacos, a South American relative of the camel. Both men and women have been depicted in illustrations from the time, although Magellan's crew supposedly only encountered the one man. Contemporary maps even began to depict the giants on the lands to the south of the Strait of Magellan. These early reports had a significant effect on the European perceptions of Patagonia at the time. The concept of the New World was still relatively fresh in the 1520s, and much speculation and wonder emanated from the people of Europe, especially the sailors and explorers who told exaggerated accounts of the things that they had seen and heard whilst traversing this strange new land. For around 300 years, the idea of giants living in Patagonia became the prominent image of this part of the world in the collective European consciousness. Magellan named the perceived new race of giants the Patagons. It is thought that this was taken from the Portuguese pata, meaning foot. Patagonia itself may actually mean land of the Bigfoot, on account of the footprints these giants were said to have left as they walked in their huge moccasin shoes. If Patagonia was indeed named in this way, this likely added to the hysteria back in Europe, and the story soon found itself draped in exaggeration and mythology. However, there is also the suggestion that Magellan named the giants after a character in a popular 16th century Spanish romance story, Primalion. The story features a giant by the name of Patagon, whom Magellan may have taken inspiration from after reading the book. Over 100 years after Magellan's reported encounter with the giants of Patagonia, another famed explorer became associated with a similar sighting. In 1628, the nephew of none other than the English explorer and privateer Sir Francis Drake published The World Encompassed, an account of his uncle's circumnavigation of the globe. The giants yet again made an appearance in this book. Drake had supposedly encountered them himself as he sailed through the region on his voyages to South America. In the book, Drake's nephew stated that Magellan may have exaggerated the sizes of the Patagons. While they certainly were tall, they were nowhere near as tall as their supposed discoverer had described them to be. Drake's nephew then continued to say that perhaps Magellan exaggerated the size of these people, thinking that nobody would ever return to somewhere as remote as Patagonia to confirm his reports. Rather than document the real peoples of South America, it was thought that Magellan and his crew opted to create a fanciful story to impress the people back home. This didn't stop the explorers of the time from adding to the legend with their own accounts and reports of giant humans on the coastlines of Patagonia. Dutch explorers Willem Schouten and Jacob Le Marie reported that they had uncovered giant human bones in Patagonia in the early 1600s, but they were unable to verify their claims. Much later, in 1766, Captain John Byron circumnavigated the world and returned with tales of giants that were over 9 feet tall. The truth became obscured once more, as the countries of Europe dived back into speculation about Patagonia as a bizarre lost world filled with enormous humans. Various scientists aggressively disputed the idea of the Patagons' existence, and the stories even heightened tensions between nations. French sailors were starting to believe that British ship crews were just using stories of these expeditions to Patagonia in search of giants to scope out entry points for an attack on French colonies in the Americas. The hysteria surrounding the giants began to die off in the late 1700s. French explorer Louis de Bougainville in 1767 stated that the tallest indigenous person he encountered in Patagonia was 5 feet and 9 inches in height, and that previous reports were extremely exaggerated. This was backed up when the official accounts of Byron's voyage were made public, which revealed that the tallest giants were in fact only 4 inches taller than the average European explorer. Slowly, the idea of Patagonia being a land of mysterious giants began to fade from European perceptions of the region. The early explorers, it would seem, had created hoaxes for dramatic effect. So who was it that the explorers actually met? The people that Magellan, Drake, Byron, and so many more supposedly met on their voyages to Patagonia are now widely considered to have been the Tehuelche. They are the indigenous inhabitants of this section of South America, and while they are reported to have been taller than the average European explorer of the time, they were certainly not mythical, monstrous giants. They were, of course, while perhaps strange to these European explorers, just another kind of human people. When the first European explorers arrived in Patagonia, the Tehuelche were living as hunter-gatherers who moved with the guanaco herds, hunting them for their meat and skins. They lived in meadows, lake shores, wetlands, and of course the coastlines of Patagonia during the winter season to escape the harsh winds of the plateaus, where they migrated during the summer. Magellan would have been the first European explorer to make contact with the various groups of indigenous Tehuelche people in 1520, and they would have had no knowledge of the European or Asian Old World prior to meeting him. It makes sense that the man Magellan encountered believed he had come from the sky. What other way would he have had to explain such an unusual encounter? Magellan had encountered the footprints of the Tehuelche people before he actually met them in person. The accounts of them being giants likely started when these footprints were found. They did indeed wear guanaco skin moccasin shoes, the furs of which caused their prints to appear much larger than they were. Following the establishment of European settlers in the Americas, the Tehuelche people received a lot of cultural and technological influence from the much more established Mapuche people of South Chile. They began to utilize domesticated horses for travel across the plains of Patagonia, and lived much like the Great Plains people of North America. This subsequently brought about social change in Tehuelche society, and they adopted different movement patterns across Argentina and Chile as a result. In the 1860s, Welsh settlers arrived in Tehuelche lands, and while relations were mainly peaceful, the Welsh tended to view them as childlike and uncivilized, adopting paternalistic attitudes towards them. The story of the Tehuelche people, like those of many indigenous groups in the Americas, sadly ends in tragedy. In the 19th century, people from Tehuelche communities were abducted against their will and shipped off to Europe to be displayed as attractions across Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, England, and France. Many demographic groups in Tehuelche society were victims of this abuse, from chiefs to children, and appallingly, many found themselves displayed in human zoos. This dark colonial practice involved exhibiting indigenous peoples alongside animals as an attraction for the general public in various European cities. An emphasis would have been placed on the inferiority of these people compared to those in Europe, and the conditions were often horrific for those housed in such places. Meanwhile, back in South America, the remaining Tehuelche people were being forced into reservations across the Santa Cruz province of Argentina, removed from their land and stripped of their freedom in favor of the growth of European colonies. The Tehuelche began to decline in number. As of 2010, there are roughly 28,000 people who consider themselves to be of Tehuelche descent in Argentina, and their population in Chile is almost non-existent. Moreover, the Tehuelche language has slowly disappeared since the initial arrival of the Spanish, and the language is now considered to be near extinct. Like many instances of colonial history, the story of the Tehuelche and their perception as the Patagonian giants is laced with dark undertones. Although initial European encounters with these indigenous communities were peaceful, relations soon took a turn when the Spanish settlers moved in and forced the Tehuelche away from their ancestral lands. Today, the legend of the Patagonian giants is long dead, debunked as a hoax. But the culture of the Tehuelche people lives on. Hopefully, it will continue to do so for a long time to come.